language. It's based on natural language. It's especially aimed at the creation of interactive fiction. And in the past, that has been command parser IF, which is a vibrant art form and will continue to surprise and delight us into the future. But it's only one of Inform's future use cases, and that's a theme that I think will run through this talk. So let me see if I can advance the slide. Yeah, so this is a talk about where the Inform project stands now and about how it's going to develop and what new features are coming on the near horizon and the sort of further horizon beyond that. So as I go on, I'm going to get more and more speculative, but I'll try to make each 5-minute segment of this talk more interesting than the previous one. That means pacing myself by starting with some fairly boring preliminaries. So in particular, I'm going to start with, in good TV show fashion, previously on NarraScope. This is my third NarraScope talk in a row, I'm very proud to say. To cover a few of the basics, Inform is a programming language. It has a compiler, and the compiler does the sort of things that compilers do. But there are several respects in which it is unusual. Firstly, most users experience it as an app or as a web service, so their workflow is more like writing than coding. They may never use a command line or a build tool or anything like that. They will instead use what we call the apps, so Inform for macOS, for Windows, or for Linux, and those apps aim to hide all of that. Now, it's an explicit goal of Inform to make this possible, so the apps are quite an important part of the project. A second unusual thing about Inform is that it doesn't compile all the way down to an executable or to assembly language, which is quickly turned into one. It compiles down to human-readable but still low-level programs, and then further tools take those the rest of the way. So this is not a unique thing. The functional programming language Haskell compiles via C, for example. But Inform is unusual in supporting multiple target languages, so currently 2 of them, as shown in this picture. And at NarraScope 1 in Boston, I sketched out how a new intermediate representation inside Inform called Inter might one day make all of this possible. Well, that has all now happened. A third unusual thing about Inform is that structures in the source text do not correspond well or at all to structures in the compiled code, and small often makes large. So here we see a small one-line source text, the laboratory is a room, and it generates what amounts to a simulation engine sitting on top of a kind of miniature operating system. And here we are, it's over 79,000 lines of output. It's very difficult to locate where is the laboratory, the concept of the laboratory, inside that code. And that affects how Inform is built and tested quite a lot. Now, all of that standing code has to come from somewhere, and at NarraScope 1, I think I used the word kit in public for the first time. So a kit is a pre-compiled block of material used by Inform to put these complicated structures together. Kits are written in a low-level language called i6, compiled to Inter, linked with more Inter, which is coming from the source text, and then translated down to either C or i6, Inform 6 that is, again. And I remember as I explained this happy scheme in Boston, at the back of the auditorium, Andrew Plotkin was kind enough to mime his head being blown off. But it all now works, and Andrew's head is still on. A fourth way in which Inform is unusual has actually gone. It used to be closed source. I announced at NarraScope 1 that I was nearly done with refactoring and rewriting it and would soon be ready to open source everything. That turned out to be untrue. At NarraScope 2, online, during, I guess, what was the hardest summer of the pandemic, I said I was getting closer now, but I prudently gave no date. I also, by the way, just in parenthesis, I spoke at both NarraScopes about what's called literate programming, and I wanted the publication of Inform to make a little contribution to that field. I'm not going to talk about literate programming again at all today, but it does remain something I care about. So this little mention is just to say I retain an interest in that. Anyway, so going public did happen. Here we are. The Git repositories for Inform went public on the 28th of April 2022, Inform's traditional birthday. people have been very kind, and I really have felt a sense of being welcomed by the open source community, which I was really just joining for the first time. So the core repository is up to 806 stars as of today, and that makes me feel very important. The American flag only has 50, after all. But then I calibrate that by looking up Python, 47,000, Swift, 60,000, Rust, 70,000. So a way to go yet. The last mouse click after 5 years of working on this was a truly surreal moment, but it was also a huge relief, and I felt I could now be struck by lightning and my life's work would not be lost. So I realized that counting up my stars like I'm counting followers on Instagram or talking about my life's work like this, it's all vanity. But it was quite an emotional moment, and I just wanted to thank everybody for caring about it. Okay, so that was 3 months ago. What we had then was a beta of the next proper release of Inform. So people are already running these betas of version 10.1. They're running it on the command line after building it themselves, or they're playing with previews of the Windows, Linux, or Mac apps, or they're using web services like borrowgove.app, or even they're doing wacky things with Docker containers and GitHub Actions and things. So this on screen here is the new version of the Mac app, and that's it running on macOS Monterey in both light mode and dark mode. So dark mode is new. So as of just today, this Mac beta is now available at Toby Nelson's GitHub pages. I have to say, time was when the deal with software is that you compiled a program and then other people played it. But it's now this complicated business shipping an app for a consumer operating system. Toby tells me that the app as of today is, quote, hardened, entitled, sealed, signed, provisioned, archived, imaged, notarized, and stapled, but not sandboxed. I am deeply grateful not to need to know what any of those words mean, and I salute Toby, along with David Kinder and Philip Chimento on Windows and Linux, for coping with this world of what operating systems have become. Okay, a little feature to mention in passing that's new here is there's a little calendar feature, a little web service which is just alerting Inform users to upcoming community events. And my hope is that this will make more people aware of the IFTF, our hosts here at NarraScope. Anyway, as I say, 10.1 is now sort of out there. The genie is clearly out of the bottle. But what we now need to do is to bring the beta period to an orderly end and make a proper release of 10.1. Now, we're very nearly there. There's just a little bit of fiddling with the public library still to sort out. But it is time that we had decent procedures for how we're going to organize releases. So I'm going to make a couple of administrivia announcements, if I may. So, firstly, distinction between release versions and just sort of unstable builds, which are stuff in progress. So, since we're now developing entirely in public, command line users who are comfortable using Git can always get the very latest state. But potentially that means there are endless different versions out there in the wild. Obviously, all versions are numbered, and we're particularly distinguishing between release versions, which are the ones we thought were ready for public use, at least when they were released we did, and unstable versions where we're quite clear that we're not offering them for public use. They're just there if you really want to work on the development. So release versions have simple version numbers in the shape x.y.z, and we're coming up on 10.1.0. Unstable versions are the commits at GitHub between releases. Now, unstable versions, to mark them, have longer version numbers. You can see here the -beta. Basically, they will always have a -alpha or a -beta in their version number to show. The +6v35 that you see there is a daily build number, and most people can ignore that. Or in fact, really everybody can ignore that. Okay, going forward, the plan is not to provide binaries of the apps for unstable versions, only for release versions. So at the moment, you can indeed get hold of copies of the apps which are showing an unstable version of 10.1, but that's really because we're just getting going. We'll take those down again as soon as there's a proper release to provide instead. Okay, just 2 minutes, which will make sense only to people who do use Git. Just to say what the flow is going to be in a very simple-minded way. Active development is on the master branch, at least for the moment. And you can always expect that to be a version which is unstable. Releases will get made off short branches purely for the purposes of making releases. And things will be numbered and labeled and tagged and so forth, as shown on this slide. And I should say this talk is being recorded, of course, but also the text will be available from the Inform website with the pictures and so forth. So people will be able to look this stuff up. Releases are going to be tagged, as I say. They're going to be presented under releases on the GitHub homepage in the usual way from its column on the right-hand side. And we will provide app installers there as associated binary files, but that won't be the only place they're available. So we're expecting to ship from the Mac App Store and so forth, as we have done in the past. Okay, little word about the version numbering. So as I say, the versions have a 3-layer version number in the form x.y.z. Just a brief word on what this means. So in a pragmatic, not really strict way, this is a semantic version number. So for those who don't use these things, semantic versioning, or SEMVer for short, it's an internet standard for how to assign version numbers to software. semver.org has a kind of slightly theological description of how to do this. Now, SEMVer was really created for component parts, things intended to be used inside of other people's programs. And in that sense, it would be very good, one might think, for Inform extensions. Well, in fact, all of the new Inform software understands semantic version numbers, and we hope people will use them in that way. In those situations where you're using software as a component part, it's a very good idea to be strictly following these rules. I tend to think, and I think others agree, that for really big umbrella systems like programming languages, really strictly following SEMVer is unhelpful, because all that happens is you keep bumping the major version up and you never use the other version numbers at all. So I'm hoping to be a bit more pragmatic. So these 3 parts of the version number are the major version, so 10, the minor version, 1, the point version, 0. So if a release is going to remove any significant functionality or it's going to add something big, the major number goes up. If we're adding something and we're not really taking away very much or only in an insignificant way, we might just bump the minor number, and for bug fixes, we would just bump the point number. So the weasel word in what I've been saying is significant. So to give an example, in 10.1, the most troublesome change to the language was that we withdrew several forms of the include brackets syntax, which is used for sort of gluing in bits of Inform 6 syntax inside of Inform source text. Well, that was a major change. Clearly, it was a major change. It caused lots of existing extensions to need some modification. On the other hand, one of the changes I'm about to announce involves things like a change to the precision with which real numbers arithmetic is calculated, and I'm going to say that that's a minor change, even though technically it does affect the behavior of an existing feature. So a really strict person might say it's major, but we're not going to. So that's what I mean by pragmatic. Okay, so let's talk about how we want to evolve the language from here. So most major programming languages, obviously we're a minor programming language, but still, major programming languages have a formal system of numbered proposal documents, and there will typically be some forum or repository which hosts these. So here are 2 examples. Swift evolution is what the Swift programming language uses, and Rust RFCs, those are requests for comment. If you're English, incidentally, RFC stands for Rugby Football Club, which is not completely inappropriate to how compiler developers work. But these are basically helpful services for users of these languages who want to see what's coming next or want to have their say about that. So today we're making the Inform Evolution repository open. I will click this button when I finish speaking. So Inform Evolution, or IE, I guess, similarly to these other language forums, it holds numbered proposal documents. So at this stage, proposals are likely to be originated by the core Inform team, as it were. And we want them to serve both as initially loose specifications, but specifications of what we intend to do, but also requests for comment. So the details in these proposals may well change. And I can certainly see that we might end up withdrawing some proposals in favor of just doing something better. But at the moment, at least, it's reasonable to assume that if something gets as far as having a proposal, it is likely to happen at some point. Not necessarily in numerical order, not necessarily all for the next public release, but it will eventually happen. And as a sort of rule of the road, as it were, I particularly want to try to follow the rule that any change to the language or the tools which is large enough that it would need to cause a version number bump, at least to the first two categories, that should be possible to relate to a proposal. Okay. Yeah, so as I say, for the moment, this really exists to help the people already working on Inform to do a bit of thinking in public. But I can see it evolving into something more than that. So when we've been open source for a bit longer, we'll clearly need to have some process for users outside of the core team to make their own proposals. And at that point, we'll probably need to have some sort of reviewing committee to act as gatekeepers and so on. But it's just too early in the day for that. What I think we're not going to let this turn into is a kind of vague, wouldn't it be nice to do something like such and such channel? Because I think that's much better discussed at the IF forum. So at the moment we have 10 proposal documents in this initial state. So they're numbered IE 0001 to 0010. And they give a reasonable picture of what we're hoping to do in the next few releases. So probably this is what would be new in the language in the next, 12 to 18 months, some sort of timescale like that. So I'm going to take a tour through this, and I'm going to run fairly quickly through a miscellany of small features which are not very interesting, and then come to a middle-sized one which might be more interesting, and finish with a very large one. So what do I mean by small? Well, here is IE 0005, called Removing Translates into Unicode. This is really just a change to make names of named Unicode characters quicker to resolve inside the compiler, and it will affect hardly anybody. The only reason that it will ultimately need a minor version number bump for the language is that it does remove a kind of sentence, X translates into Unicode as Y. Hardly anybody ever uses that sentence. All they'll need to do is cross it out, and everything will be fine. But the rules say that there has to be a proposal relating to this, so this is an example of a small proposal for a small change. Okay, now IE 0008, another small proposal. In the end, it may have rather larger effects than it seems. So it's called faster memory allocation. So Danny Willis has been thinking about this. And it's essentially proposing a low-level change to how the Inform runtime claims and releases memory with no language change at all. So strictly speaking, this doesn't need a proposal at all. And it may be that we can just introduce it and users will never know. But I think it's better that we document this. It is a significant piece of work. It might slightly change the memory behavior for programs that are just about to run out of memory. Okay, so next up. Here we have one I mentioned earlier, so 0007. So this is not to change the language, but just to improve the precision of real arithmetic that's used inside Inform. For any C programmers in the room, essentially this is to make Inform's real numbers doubles rather than floats. The main motivation for that is that floats are just so limited in resolution, or whatever you want to call it, precision, that you can't convert regular numbers to float and back again without losing accuracy. And you get these rather odd effects. So look at what 1.333 times n is there. In a float, you lose not very much, 14 parts in whatever number it is, billion. But still, it's not ideal. With double precision, it would mean that any Inform number value can be faithfully promoted to real number, and then you can take the integer part of that, and it will be the same number you started with. Anyway, as I say, it's a small deal, but I hope a useful one. IE 0004. Sorry, yes, the slide here says faster memory allocation. It should say access to data files. This is an example of a purely additive proposal. It's to add a new feature to Inform which won't cause any existing stuff to break, or just possibly there might be trouble because of a new name clashing with an old name, but that would be all. It enables Inform to take advantage of a feature of the blob packaging format for story files, which has existed for a long time, in which binary data files can be packaged up with them. As I say, all the surrounding software has supported this for ages. Inform never has. That seemed an omission, and this proposal is to put that right. It all looks innocuous. It might turn out to be, I won't say a Trojan horse, but a sort of signpost anyway for how we might think about handling binary files more generally in Inform down the road. So a lot of these small proposals maybe point to larger things we might someday do. I will finish on these quick things soon, but here's another one, 0006, appropriately enough, although that's by accident. It's actually an Inform 6 proposal, and it's just to have a joint way to annotate programs in Inform 6 that might better meet the needs of both compilers, really. We don't actually propose to use this yet, but we want to have it for things we know we shall do someday. Okay, moving on. Where are we? Yes, so here is 0002. So I'm going to give you two small proposals which are both aiming to help power users who have large Inform projects and they want to put those projects under source control. So, for example, to host them at GitHub. So 0002, it's a convenience in which Inform automatically makes .gitignore files so that the right part of your Inform project and its materials folder is what is actually put under source control when you create a new Git repository. So this is just to make it less fuss to start out a nice-looking repository holding an Inform project. And my other sort of large projects feature is 0003. So this is for dividing the source text into multiple files. And it's intended as a drop-in replacement for what some projects like Counterfeit Monkey are already doing, which is they do have a massive source text, and they deal with that by having large numbers of what are supposedly extensions, but really are not anything of the kind. So, for example, this is actual text from Counterfeit Monkey at the top there. It says, include Act 1 among sightseers by Counterfeit Monkey. What they've done, of course, is to create an extension called Act 1 among sightseers, and then they've given it the author name Counterfeit Monkey, for what it's worth. And then in square brackets, they've said book 1, blah, 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 blah. What they mean is that that actual supposed extension contains the text of book 1 of the source. Well, I think what they really would like to express is that book 1 is in a different file. And so that's what the intent of this change is, to make that possible. And it would mean that, I mean, they get the same functionality as now in one sense, but they no longer have a huge list of extensions. They no longer have to set up these external files in a sort of slightly clumsy way, claiming to be extensions when they're not really. Okay, so that completes my miscellany of what you might call harmless, nice-to-have proposals that really don't set the world alight at all. So here is my medium-sized one. i.e. 0001. So this is to give extensions a directory format to hold resources instead of to have them as now a single file. And again, this might really sound quite dull, but its implications are, I think, significant. So just to recap what the current situation is, as it stands today, an extension, which is a sort of piece of Inform source text intended to be used by other people, as well as yourself, today that's a single text file, with the file name extension .i7x. And the idea of this is that it contains, as I say, Inform source text, so new phrases and rules and so on. This example on screen, well, the writing will be too small to see, but it's Locksmith by Emily Short, and that provides a kind of tidy way of handling locks and keys. Well, after a while, extensions go right back to the beginning of Inform 7, but we soon found if we wanted extensions to contain some documentation about how to use them and some examples of how they can be used and even test cases. And the trouble is we had nowhere to put these. These had to be squeezed into the same file. So towards the bottom of the Locksmith file, for example, you find a chunk of what is really documentation and what is really an example program to use it. More subtly, I think it's fair to say a lot of extensions include a bunch of Inform 6 code inside this slightly funky include brackets sentence. And they do that because they have no better way of shipping some low-level code along with an extension. So the position we're at now is that extensions have for quite a while been straining the limits of what you can reasonably cram into a single text file. And there are other needs as well. If you want an entire kit, that's very difficult. If you wanted sound effects, pictures, data files, whatever, you really couldn't do that. The French language extension for having games that play out in French can't come with preform files in French, never mind what those are if you haven't dabbled with this. They can't come with natural language metadata bundles, all that sort of stuff. So right now it's a difficult thing to distribute a really ambitious extension. You have to say to people, use this extension, but download a whole load of this other stuff as well. So I note that, so the reason for this slide is to make the point that 3 of the extensions that are built into Inform require kits to make them work, and it's not unreasonable to think other extensions might require kits as well. So under the proposal, existing extensions work exactly as now, so nothing's being withdrawn, but it will be easy to migrate those to a new directory format, and then you can add all sorts of stuff. All of the extra stuff really is optional, so you can have as much of this as you want or as little as you want. But this is what a large extension might look like. So this is a file system listing, just showing sort of folders and their contents. I'm not going to talk through everything that's here. Obviously, these proposals will all soon be open to look at. But you get the general idea. You can put all kinds of resources in with an extension and distribute the whole thing as a single understandable lump. Particularly notable here is that there is JSON format metadata about these extensions, and this enables all sorts of web services to deal in an automated way with downloading and gathering extensions. Some of the work in the Inform compiler to support all of that has already been done. So it's worth noting this, getting to the point where we can use these extensions is going to require some work in the Inform apps, as well as the core software, because those apps do a certain amount of business filing away extensions and downloading them from the internet and so on, and that stuff is going to need to change. So this is actually a fairly major change. It will affect quite a lot of things up and down the Inform stack. And if I could just digress on this a little further, this is really part of a sort of vaguer, wider manifesto for how we want to distribute things in future. So at present, people share extensions, which is fine. There is a sort of central registry for these called the public library, and it doesn't currently handle versioning all that well. It assumes that you'll always only want the latest version of something, which is no longer really the case. It's quite selective, and there's no very good way of making registries of your own. And a lot of the design of the build manager of Inform, which is called imbuild, was done in order to solve this. So the dream, I guess, is as you see on this slide. Imbuild would notice that it was missing one extension that it needed in order to build something. It would communicate with some central registry, get back some metadata on what the registry had, and then download the appropriate version if it could find a version that would fit with the needs of all the other things. But we're not there yet, and I think we're not yet at a point where we can write a formal proposal. One thing we have to decide is whether we want to have a central registry. So some languages do, some languages don't. So I'm talking about things like there's Ruby gems for Ruby, the Node Package Manager, NPM, for JavaScript people, the comprehensive Perl archive network, and so on. We are sort of close to having something like this because of the Friends of i7 collection of extensions, which is already on GitHub. But still, it's all just a bit too vague to have a proposal as yet. Nevertheless, I want to hold it out as something which I hope is in the future. So I think that clears away the modest-sized proposals and leaves the big one. So this is IE 0009, and we're calling this dialogue. I think this is actually quite a big deal. I think it will change how Inform is used in practice by quite a lot of people. It opens up the possibility of creating quite different interactive experiences than you can make now. So the one-sentence pitch for this feature would be that it offers sort of flowing conversational systems which are straightforward to write in the same way that IF languages like Ink or Twine seem very natural to handle, but which still has the full power of the informed world model and natural language conditions and actions and so on underneath to enhance all of that. So who is this for? Well, it's intended to help authors of Command Parser IF to incorporate dialogue better into their parser games. And it is intended to help authors of non-Command Parser IF to write entirely dialogue-based stories. And it is also intended to help users in the commercial space to build dialogue engines into games which may not be graphical at all. And, we don't see any contradiction in serving all three of these groups of users. We think, we are a big, varied and exciting community, which is really the motto of NarraScope. We're doing all kinds of things in all kinds of ways. And I think it's perfectly appropriate to recognize that authors in the 2020s want a different selection of things than authors in the early 2000s wanted. And, Inform exists to serve its authors. Well, this proposal is going to make enormous additions to Inform, but it actually takes away almost nothing. So this will actually be quite a non-disruptive change. Nevertheless, it is likely to be a major release of Inform. It may well end up being the lead feature of Inform 11.1 when we get there. Well, so what is dialogue? It's the ability to have sections of an Inform source text which look like a printed play or a movie script rather than like a printed novel or a short story. So it has always been a design goal of Inform that if you're in doubt about what the syntax for something should be, you imitate what the kind of printed pre-computer version would look like. And the same is true here. So the dialogue system, Emily has asked me to say designed with Emily Short, but I think it's fair to say without her ideas it wouldn't have got going. She, of course, is one of the world's leading narrative designers and is better known than me, so I've really no need to say who she is here. But in particular, she's an expert in this conversational modeling space. The syntax for this, as you will see, I hope, it looks simple and very easy to write, but it gains great flexibility because it is underpinned by Inform underneath. So a very simple fragment might look like this. Now, section headings are nothing new in Inform. So here is a section heading, section 1 at the Sawyer farm. What's new is that this one has been marked in a new way by marking it as dialogue. Now that means that the sentences under this section heading, though not elsewhere in the story file, but under this section heading, they contain dialogue. And dialogue has a different syntax from the rest of Inform. So if we take this apart a bit, as I've just said, the section heading is marked as holding dialogue. Then the content of this section, well, assertions and rules and tables and all of the ingredients you can normally put into Inform are not allowed in dialogue section. Instead, you have what are called dialogue beats, or just beats for short. Now, a satisfying scene in a story is going to be many beats, possibly flowing one into another. So you can think of them as little fragmentary bits of scenes, really. A beat, nevertheless, can have multiple lines of dialogue or narration. But there'll be a single reason why a beat is being performed. And the reason is indicated by what's called the cue. So that's the bracketed bit at the beginning, where it says, in this case, it says about the fence. So you'll notice that beats can be about people or things. In this case, it's about a thing, a fence. They can also be about abstract ideas. So I'm not going to talk further about this, but we actually do have another proposal that's spun off from this one, i.e. 0010, to provide a new kind called concept in Inform, which can be used for sort of abstract ideas. You could create a concept called world peace, for example, and then use that as a conversational subject. Anyway, here we have a fence. That is actually a thing in the story. Well, these lines of dialogue are only performed if the people saying them are actually audible to the player. So if the speaker is somewhere else or has left the story entirely, then any line spoken by them won't be spoken. And in fact, this beat would never be performed unless both Huckleberry and Tom were around. So you don't get non sequiturs by accident, or not easily. Now, you can add all sorts of standard Inform world model stuff to this and have your dialogue depend on that. So if we build this out a bit more, here we have a game in two sections. The first section does some regular Inform stuff to set up a farm with a fence in it, and two boys. And then the second section is some dialogue about that. Now notice here that Huckleberry's line of dialogue is conditional. He only speaks it if the fence is unpainted. So, all of this looks still like a fairly simple sort of dialogue tree kind of deal, but it's more flexible than simple examples show. So if we take a look at this, this shows some of the many ways you can customize this apparently simple content. So, for example, the speaker of one of the lines in this slide is, quotes, a boy other than Huckleberry. So it doesn't have to be specifically Tom who replies, just anybody who's around who meets this description. And that can be any informed description. That might even be the player, for example. And really, in all of these slides, anywhere where you can see something, all of the normal rules of inform apply, and you can have something more general. Okay. It's also worth noting you can have lines which are explicitly from one person to another and which will only be performed if that person is actually able to, so can sort of see and hear that other person. And in fact, marking a piece of dialogue as being to somebody also makes it slightly more likely that that person will reply next if there's going to be a choice. So something else that can happen is that dialogue can mention concepts, can sort of bring up concepts which haven't been part of the conversation so far. So Huckleberry mentioning the fence. See that windblown old fence? This now makes the fence something which is a current subject of conversation when it wasn't previously. So that could be the entire beat that you're looking at there, just one line of dialogue. But if that line is performed, then the idea of the fence is kind of somehow in the conversational air. And so this might cause the game to start another beat, a quite separate beat, which is only ever performed in circumstances where the fence is being talked about. So the first beat has kind of flowed naturally into the second. Now, there is a sort of runtime system called the director, implemented by a new kit called Director Kit, which is in charge of making these decisions. And we haven't got a long time to go into exactly what it does, but it is trying to manage things in what seems like a natural way. Now, I've already said that you can have sort of lines of dialogue which are conditional on certain things being the case, but you can also have dialogue which changes the world in the same way that in plays you can have stage directions. So, for example, notice here in the upper example, Tom's line of dialogue, Tom, now the fence is painted. So any condition that inform can make true with a now, so now plus any condition that it can assert is true, can be put in there. So if Tom performs this line of dialogue, and recall he won't do so if he's not within earshot, but if he is in earshot and this line is performed, then that change to the world model is made. More interestingly, perhaps, Huckleberry down here, after his line, an action is performed, taking the paintbrush. So in inform, these kind of changes to the world are thought of as actions, and in the inform world model, any person can perform any action, and here Huckleberry will be the actor. It's also possible to do something like Huckleberry before taking, so in this, so you could say before taking the paintbrush, and then taking the paintbrush happens after Huckleberry's spoken his line. Here, Huckleberry performs the line after taking the paintbrush. If he tries taking the paintbrush and it doesn't work because, let's say, some other rule applies, somebody snatches the paintbrush out of his hands, something like that, then Huckleberry doesn't continue with his line. Okay, there are lots more ways to customize these sort of dialogue features, but you get the general idea, which is that what looks at first like it's a straightforward script of just person's name, thing they say, is actually much more sort of blended in with the informed language. You can do all kinds of interesting things by setting up interesting relations. You can kind of create knowledge models. You can get people to reply only to things that they know about in some abstract way, and so on. There's a lot you could do with this system. So, it's worth saying something about choices. I haven't got time to go into this in enormous detail now, but as I say, there's the proposal. So in this dialogue system, we're offering choices in two different ways. So in one way, there's always going to be a finite set of choices which are presented as sort of text. So you can choose here between the options, no, I'd sooner build a raft, or I suppose, in reply to Huckleberry's question. Now, of course, you don't have to have, I mean, it's not fixed in the sense of it's always the same two choices. The system handles all the usual kinds of things like eliminating things you've chosen before and making some choices conditional and being able to make choices defaults and all kinds of stuff like that. But nevertheless, it's fundamentally a sort of choice-based systems view of what sort of choices to offer. The director, I should say, which is the runtime manager I mentioned, does all of its business of things like how to display questions and how to get answers to them, how to offer these choices and how to find out what the player wants to do. All of that stuff is done through activities and rulebooks, like all of the rest of the stuff in runtime Inform. And that makes it highly customizable. So, these choices do not have to all look the same. And you can imagine all kinds of interesting interfaces to them in games. So as I say, that's one way that choices can be offered as a sort of list of alternatives to choose between. We hope that people will be able to use that if they want to make entirely choice-based fictions that don't have a command parser at all. If, on the other hand, people do want to have a command parser, you can also have your choices respond to those. So this looks very similar, and that's quite intentional. What we found when making these little examples was that our examples of what would choices look like in a command parser world were not very different to what they would look like without. So here, what goes on here is that when we reach this kind of choice point in the beat, we go back to regular play. The dialogue breaks off after Huckleberry's first line here for a turn of the story. So in a command parser game, that's going to mean the player gets an opportunity to type a command, and then that command will be parsed, it'll be turned into an action, and then the action will be tried. So what happens here is that we look at that action and then we continue the dialogue appropriately. So if the player has examined the paint, Huckleberry will chip in something about the paint. If he's done anything else, Huckleberry will kind of give a bit of a clue that it's a bit disappointing that you didn't take up this hint or something like that. And the dialogue then continues. Well, there are various ways that these can be customized as well. To put it mildly, choices are very heavily customizable, and there's a lot more that could be said. As I say, the full written proposal is IE 0009, and it's at the Inform Evolution forum, which I will make open as soon as this talk has finished. It's all set ready to do so. So in about an hour's time, anybody who would like to look at this is welcome to do so. So that's all I have time to talk about with dialogue at the moment, but I think it is going to be a significant change in Inform. It takes very little away. Non-dialogue sections, of course, aren't affected by any of this. If you simply don't have dialogue sections, your stories will work exactly as now. But as I say, it's not for choice-based games only. If you're writing a command parser game and you've always wanted a slightly nicer way of handling commands like ask, Zarf about pirate hat or something, this would be a much better system for handling how to respond to those questions. Okay, now there are sort of hazier hopes for the future of this language, which just haven't reached the stage of written proposals as yet. One of those I've kind of mentioned, automatic fetching of extensions and things from the internet. Yeah, nice to have, I think, but we're not quite at the point of specifying that. Better support for more interesting data structures, I think in a kind of computer science-y way. Inform is not very much used for traditional computer science tasks, but no reason it shouldn't be, at least some of the time. And it's surprising how many, games require some, hardcore programming. Yeah, so Danny Willis has been thinking about this. We're not at the point of making a proposal yet, but I think it's fair to say that his extension data structures give some sort of indication of the sort of thing we might do. And that's likely to need improvements to the kinds system in Inform. This is all a bit further off. We'd like to handle namespaces better, which is to say at all. Namespaces are, it's not completely obvious how to square namespaces with a natural language. approach. They do sort of exist in English. I might say this book is red in the sense that I have read it, or this book is red in the sense that it is not green. You could say that's kind of a namespace thing. I know those are actually just homophones, but I guess this is a spoken talk. Still, it's not completely obvious how to do namespaces. I think it is clear that we need to have some answer to this question at some point, and I see it as being a bit related to the data structures work, in fact. Anyway, as I say, there are other things that we might want to think about. The current list of proposals is not sort of the only things that we're sort of mulling over. Well, next I want to talk about Inform in the commercial space. So, the Inform toolchain, it's no longer tied to specific interactive fiction virtual machines. So you can turn your Inform source text into native C programs. And you might reasonably ask, well, I mean, how does that help? Why is it good to do that? One answer is they do run a bit faster than native code, but really the answer is that enables them to be linked into large external projects more easily. I say more easily because people have done this before. There have certainly been apps which in a very elegant way have made use of story files, but still, it would be much nicer if you could just sort of use Inform as a piece of your build in some large project, and you now kind of can. From the Inform side, there is a working C API which lets external C programs communicate with Inform source texts and sort of manage how their text is presented to the world, but lets Inform do as much as it wants to do. So, I mean, a reasonable question is how could you plug that into the sort of really big beasts of the commercial games world? So technologies like the Unity or the Unreal game engines. And we would like Inform to be better at serving people who are using these systems. So what happens at the moment is Inform is surprisingly often used as a prototyping tool in the games industry. But when the prototype has reached a certain point, it pretty much has to be thrown away, and then everything is done in some different way. And we'd like to at least provide the path so that, the prototype could become part of the actual game in the end. Well, yeah, there is precedent for this, it's worth saying. The wonderful Ink language has plugins for both Unity and Unreal Engine already, and people very much do use that in the game space. So it seems possible that we might be able to do something similar with Inform. Now, how much progress we can actually make on that is going to depend on whether volunteers come forward who are ready to build out the other side of it, the Unity and Unreal sides of the technology. But here is the picture as I understand it, and I'm obviously not an expert on this. I'd like to thank my friend Alan Hinchcliffe for giving me some advice on this. I believe it's the case that Unreal Engine at the present is probably the easier target to work with. So Unreal is a game engine, as I said. It has a built-in scripting language called Blueprint, and it's possible to write games using only Blueprint scripts. And in that model, you're never really compiling Unreal at all. You're using it sort of as an interpreter, a sort of, a blob that you're given by Epic, I think, are the publishers of Unreal. And you just use it as is. Now, it's hard to see how those developers could usefully compile what they're doing in with material from Inform. But the more usual thing is that people who are developing for Unreal recompile the engine for themselves, and they sometimes do that in order to add features to it or wrap them up in some way. Or there may be some reason why they need to in their own build process, but it's quite a common thing to do. And the Unreal Engine is written in C++, and that makes it quite easy to link with C being produced by Inform. Now, in order to make that at all a nice experience for developers in the Unreal world, what we need is for somebody to write a nice C++ wrapper which goes between the two, really, which picks up the functionality offered by the C API from the Inform side of things, and just wires it up nicely to scripting features in Blueprint so that the Blueprint scripts in the main game can communicate with the Inform story that's going on the Inform side of things. We think that's probably the easier task of the two. But as I say, whether we can make progress really depends on whether somebody who's, uses Unreal and knows their stuff would come forward as a volunteer. The picture on Unity, it's actually not that different, but there is a complication. And the complication is that Unity, the engine, is written in C#, not C++. And C# is a tiny bit troublesome at interfacing with C code. It's possible to get around this. C# has mechanisms to interact with DLLs of C, but it's a pain. It might lead to situations where you had to keep quitting Unity, the app, in order to retry your game and all this kind of stuff. We think that the cleaner way of doing it would be to give Inform the ability to output C#. I mentioned earlier it can output either i6 or C at the moment. Perfectly conceivable it could output C# instead, so that it could output your story file as a single C# class, and then again somebody could write a nice wrapper to make that interact better with the rest of Unity. So, as I say, all of this stuff, I can't make any promises on this. It very much depends on whether people in the commercial space or hobbyists who are very familiar with the commercial space want to come forward and work on it. But a lot of the work on the Inform side is done. There is already a working API to let text flow in and out of a source file from outside, and so on. The advice that we've had is that the task of making plugins like these shouldn't be so enormous. Okay, the next thing I want to turn to is other ways in which you might plug in Inform as a component of a hybrid sort of system. So I'm going to be very brief. A handful of examples might show things one could do. Strange new worlds. So firstly, there's no reason why a commercial space game that is entirely graphical couldn't still use Inform, even if text doesn't on its face play any part in it. So Inform is actually, for example, quite a good way of modeling things like what characters are going to do, how they should react to things, things like what little storylet moment should happen next, given what has already happened and what the state of the game is, and so on. It's perfectly plausible to imagine you could use Inform as a nice way to express that kind of game logic. More abstractly, Inform is already quite a fun tool to use to generate text. So generating pseudo-random text is kind of as old as gaming. So people as old as me may remember the 1984 BBC micro game Elite, which had a pseudo-random galaxy map, and it had planets exporting things like carnivorous arts graduates was the famous example which made it onto Wikipedia, but there were all kinds of commodities you could buy and sell. And even outside of the world of games, procedurally generated text has a kind of suggestive quality to it, which makes it, although it's not interactive, there's a certain sense in which, because it is regeneratable, it has a certain interactive quality. And people enjoy it for its own sake. There are, of course, excellent proc-gen festivals. So Emily Short's Annals of the Preagues is a good example of that, and that was made partly using Inform. But all of this could be taken further. So procedurally generated text made by Inform could then be used to create training data for sort of large language model systems to use, for example. We could imagine using Inform to make toy worlds for the training of sort of AI systems. Moving on to which, consider the possibilities for connecting Inform up with something like GPT-3, which is a so-called large language model. So I can show you just a handful of silly little examples that we made using OpenAI. This is the Da Vinci model of GPT-3. And it was asked to work out the Inform source text here for how to describe things that you might see in an American living room circa 1977. Among the text it has invented, we see a large boxy television that takes up most of the space on the table, for example. If we tell it instead, no, we want a Victorian setting, now it says of the table that the table is made of rosewood and has a marble top. Well, so there are all sorts of obstacles to using GPT-3 in production games. It's a commercial thing, and the fees to use it scale pretty badly. It's also true that, like all large language models, it tends to hallucinate and may say things you don't really want it to say. I mean, back there it said that the TV was on the table. Well, we didn't say that. It just seems to have thought that was a nice decorative thing to say, but that's not reflected in the world model, and so on. So, this technology, I think it's not really at a point where you could use it necessarily for something you trust in an actual game where you want to really control the effect, but this technology is on the march. And my point with these last few slides is just to say that as Inform is sort of newly re-architected, it could be connected to a bunch of this stuff. So I've very nearly finished. I've just got one slide, and if you'll just indulge me, I just want to finish on a personal note. My father, Peter, who is here in the blue shirt, died just as I was working on this talk, and I just want to remember him here, really. He was an electronics engineer, and he worked on things like scanners to help firemen see through smoke, image intensifiers, as they're called. He is making an incredible contraption here, which seems rather appropriate to what I've just been talking about, where he is connecting up binoculars to a digital camera. And he did this in order to recover the image inside some slide transparencies in the family that we'd had for like 40 years, but couldn't work out any way of scanning. This machine worked. He also worked on the Hubble Space Telescope, where he did less woodwork, I may say. The guy sitting next to him smiling is Toby Nelson, who is the Macinform maintainer. Peter was a good maker of things, much better than me. He built my first computer from component parts. He soldered it together over what seemed 2 absolutely endless weekends, but it was an epic task. This was an Acorn Atom. It had 12K of memory. It ran at 512 kilohertz. So I'm sure there are people in this room old enough to have had computers that ran in megahertz. I'm one of the few who had a computer that ran in kilohertz. And that was the computer on which I wrote my first ever adventure game. So I think, if you'll forgive me, on this rather sentimental slide, I will come to an end and invite questions.